At its peak, the Holden plant at Elizabeth covered 300 acres of South Australian farmland and employed 4,500 workers across 3 shifts. They built a car every 76 seconds, the Commodore, the Kingswood before it, the EH and the FJ before that. The car Australians drove more than any other, Australia's own car, built by Australian hands. Then the decisions began. Tariffs came down 57% to 5% over 26 years. The dollar surged on a mining boom that made exports impossible. Detroit filed for bankruptcy and killed the export program overnight. A $1 billion rescue package collapsed when a new government cut $500 million in its first weeks. And on a December afternoon in 2013, a treasurer stood in Parliament and dared General Motors to leave. They left. On the 20th of October 2017, the last Holden ever built in Australia, a red VF Commodore, rolled off the Elizabeth line. Today, the press shop bays where 100-ton cranes stamped steel stand darkened and repurposed. Mushrooms grow where Commodores were made. This is the story of how a saddlery founded in 1856 became the most important factory in Australia, how 7 million cars and 69 years of manufacturing ended with a phone call between Canberra and Detroit, and what was lost when the line went quiet. Not just the cars, but the work, the suburb, the purpose, and the idea that this country could make its own things. If there was ever a Holden in your driveway, or your dad's driveway, or your grandfather's, hit subscribe, because this is the story of how it got there, and why it stopped. Chapter 1. The Saddler's Son and the Last Ship Out. The story begins with a death and a departure. In 1851, in the English Midlands town of Walsall, Staffordshire, a saddler and hardware merchant died and left his business to his widow and eldest son. His younger boy, James Alexander Holden, 15 years old, already trained in leather, got nothing. Not the workshop, not the name above the door. Not a future in Walsall. What he got instead was a letter of encouragement from a colonist named George Fife Angus and a berth aboard the bark Tiberius, sailing from London in November 1854. James arrived in Adelaide on the 14th of February 1855, Valentine's Day, as it happens, though there's no evidence, he noticed. He was 19. He had a saddler's hands and no capital. And here's a detail that matters. For more than a century, published histories of Holden got the year of James's arrival wrong, placing it in 1852. It took a retired employee named Neil Pogson, working through shipping records at the Holden Retirees Club decades later, to set the record straight. The company's own mythology couldn't get its birthday right. But James didn't need mythology. He needed customers. In 1856, he founded J.A. Holden and Company at the corner of King William Street and Rundle Street, Adelaide, a wholesale saddlery producing saddles, whips and harnesses for a colony that ran on horses. South Australia in the 1850s was a place where a man who could work leather would never go hungry. The pastoral industry was booming. Settlers were pushing into country that would kill their horses faster than they could replace them. And every horse needed a saddle, every bullock team needed harnesses, and every station needed whips that wouldn't crack apart in the dry heat. James Holden supplied them. He won government contracts, including one for 165 horses and 210 bullocks to support the construction of the Overland Telegraph Line, that mad, magnificent project stringing copper wire across 2,000 miles of desert to connect Australia to the world. His saddlery didn't just serve the colony, it helped build it. He died on the 1st of June, 1887, aged 52. He never saw a motor car. He never imagined one. He left behind a successful leather business, a son named Henry James who would run it, and a grandson who would turn it into something that changed Australia. That grandson's name was Edward Weewool Holden, and he was the one who looked at the horses and saw that they were finished. Chapter 2. The Pivot That Built a Nation. Edward Holden was born on the 14th of August, 1885, into a family that had done well from leather. By the time he joined the firm in 1905, Holden and Frost, the partnership his father Henry James had formed with a German-born craftsman named Henry Adolph Frost, was one of Adelaide's most respected businesses. They'd expanded from saddlery into carriage building and metalwork. They employed dozens. They were comfortable. Edward wasn't interested in comfortable. He was interested in the machines he'd started seeing on Adelaide's streets. Unreliable, noisy, imported, and obviously the future. By 1907, he'd convinced his father that automobiles would eventually replace horses entirely, and that the family business needed to be ready. The war proved him right in ways nobody expected. When German U-boats began disrupting shipping lanes during the First World War, the supply of imported car bodies dried up. The Australian government, desperate to keep vehicles on the road, banned imported car bodies outright and passed legislation requiring that 2/3 of chassis imports be fitted with locally built bodies. Overnight, every car arriving in Australia as a bare chassis needed an Australian company to finish it. Henry James Holden saw the opportunity. In late 1917, he founded a new venture, registered on the 25th of February 1919 as Holden's Motor Body Builders Limited, HMBB. The name was modest. The ambition wasn't. By 1923, HMBB was producing 12,000 car bodies per year, fitting Australian-made steel and timber and upholstery onto chassis from Ford, Dodge, Buick, Chevrolet and Studebaker. That's 12,000 in a country of 5.5 million people. Every body built by hand by workers who'd learned their trade in leather and wood and were now learning steel and paint and glass in a shed-to-factory operation that was growing faster than anyone in Adelaide could quite believe. In 1924, General Motors came calling. They signed an exclusive supply contract with HMBB and funded a massive new factory at Woodville, in Adelaide's western suburbs. By 1925, Holden was the largest car body manufacturer in the Southern Hemisphere. More than 22,000 bodies a year, an assembly operation that dwarfed anything else in Australia. Then the world fell apart. The Great Depression hit Australian manufacturing like a hammer dropped from height. Holden's production crashed from 34,000 units in 1930 to just 1,651 in 1931. 95% of the work gone in 12 months. The company that had seemed unstoppable was facing bankruptcy. Edward Holden sailed to the United States to negotiate the only deal that could save it. In 1931, General Motors purchased HMBB and merged it with its existing Australian subsidiary to form General Motors-Holden Limited, GMH. An Australian family business, built from saddlery leather and colonial grit, was now a subsidiary of the largest corporation on earth. GM inherited an Australian identity overnight. Whether they understood what they'd bought, that's a different question. Chapter 3. The man they wrote out of the story. His name was Lawrence John Hartnett, and without him there would be no Holden car. Not the one Australians remember. Not the one that became a religion. Born on the 26th of May, 1898, in Woking, Surrey, Hartnett was a mechanical engineer, a Royal Air Force veteran of the First World War, and, when before Australia, the head of General Motors' Vauxhall subsidiary in England. He arrived in Melbourne in March 1934 as GMH's new managing director, a compact-driven Englishman with a conviction that Australia could and should build its own car from scratch. Not assemble someone else's, build its own. By 1937, 3 years into the job, Hartnett had GMH producing over 32,000 cars a year and claiming 40% of the Australian market. He was good at the business, but the business wasn't what drove him. What drove him was the idea, almost an obsession, that a country the size of Australia, with roads that punished European cars and distances that demanded something tougher, deserved a vehicle designed for its own conditions. The Second World War interrupted the dream and, paradoxically, made it possible. GMH converted to military production on a scale that transformed the company. Across factories at Woodville, Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne, Pagewood in Sydney and Brisbane, the workforce built aero engines, aircraft components, anti-tank guns, torpedoes, amphibious landing craft, and military vehicles. Hartnett himself served as Director of Ordnance Production from 1940 to 1945. The company that had been fitting bodies onto imported chassis was now manufacturing precision weapon systems. The skills, the tooling, the workforce capability, all of it was being built, war by war, contract by contract, for the day when the guns stopped, and the assembly lines could be turned to something else. In 1944, while the war was still grinding on, Hartnett flew to New York and pitched his dream directly to GM chairman Alfred Sloan. He wanted £3 million to develop an all-Australian car. Sloan, by every account, despised the idea. He called Australia a goddamn socialist setup and saw no commercial logic in funding a car for a market of 7 million people on the far side of the planet. But he approved the project, grudgingly and with a critical condition: not a cent of American money. The £3 million would come from Australian banks. The Commonwealth Bank and the Bank of Adelaide put up the funds. And then GM did what GM always does. They took control. Hartnett wanted an Australian-designed car. GM insisted on an American one, the 195Y15, a post-war Chevrolet proposal that had been rejected for the US market. The car that would become Australia's own was, from the drawing board, someone else's cast-off. In December 1946, Hartnett was removed as head of GMH. The official reason was unsanctioned initiatives. The real reason was that Hartnett had become too Australian for an American company, too attached to the idea that the car should belong to the country that would buy it. He was replaced by an American named Harold Bettel. He was never invited to the launch of the car he had championed for a decade. 3 test prototypes had been hand-built in Detroit in 1946 and secretly shipped to Fisherman's Bend. On the 29th of November 1948, at the Fisherman's Bend Social Hall, Prime Minister Ben Chifley stood before 400 guests as silver curtains parted to reveal a cream-coloured sedan on black velvet, spotlit like a jewel, while a 10-piece orchestra played Brahms's Waltz in A-flat. Chifley looked at the car and said 3 words that entered Australian folklore: "She's a beauty." Before a single production model had been built, dealers held more than 18,000 orders. By 1951, the waiting list topped 70,000. The Holden 48215, priced at £733, roughly 2 years' average wages, hit number 1 in passenger car sales by 1950. Australia had its own car. The man who'd made it happen was watching from the outside, and General Motors now owned the most powerful brand in Australian manufacturing. A brand they hadn't built, didn't fully understand, and would one day decide they no longer needed. Chapter 4. The factory that swallowed the wheat fields. To understand what the Elizabeth plant was, you need to understand the man who conjured it from farmland. Sir Thomas Playford served as Premier of South Australia for 27 years, 1938 to 1965. When he took office, the state's wealth came from sheep and wheat. By the time he left, factory employment had increased by 168%, and South Australia had the highest value of secondary production per capita of any Australian state. Playford didn't inherit an industrial economy. He manufactured one, using the levers a state premier could reach: lower company taxes than New South Wales or Victoria, cheaper housing through the South Australian Housing Trust, better industrial relations than Melbourne's militant shop floors, and a personal willingness to court any manufacturer who'd set up south of the border. In the early 1950s, the Housing Trust purchased 3,000 acres of former wheat fields on the Gawler Plains, 27 kilometres north of Adelaide. The satellite city built on that land was named Elizabeth, with Queen Elizabeth II's personal permission, and officially inaugurated on the 16th of November 1955. It was designed on a British neighbourhood model, with wide streets, open green spaces, and affordable brick houses built by the Trust, specifically to attract workers. And it targeted one workforce above all: British migrants. Advertising campaigns ran in England promising sunshine, space, a house you could afford, and a job at the end of the road. They came, and the job at the end of the road was General Motors-Holden. In May 1958, construction began on the GMH Elizabeth plant with a ceremonial concrete pour, witnessed by Managing Director Earl Dowam. Stage 1 opened in 1960 with 1,400 employees. Body and vehicle assembly followed in 1962, after tooling transferred north from the old Woodville factory. In 1963, the first complete vehicle rolled off the Elizabeth line, a Holden EH, the fastest-selling Australian car ever made, with more than 250,000 sold in 18 months. That same year, Queen Elizabeth II toured the factory bearing her name. She walked the line where migrants from a dozen countries were building the car that carried hers. The total investment, £7.5 million. The scale of what Playford and GM had built on those wheat fields was becoming clear. By the time the plant reached full capacity, it covered 123 hectares, more than 300 acres of factory under the South Australian sun. 5 major departments stretched across the site: the press shop, where steel coils were stamped into body panels in 15-metre-high bays fitted with 100-ton overhead cranes; the automated body shop, where robotic welders stitched panels into shells; the paint shop, The trim shop, where upholstery and dashboards and wiring looms turned a painted shell into something you could sit in. And the general assembly line, where engines shipped from Fisherman's Bend in Port Melbourne met the bodies that had started as flat steel 3 buildings ago. Steel coils arrived at one end of Elizabeth. Finished cars drove out the other. At peak, in 2003, that process employed 4,500 workers across 3 shifts and produced 620 vehicles per day. 1 car every 76 seconds. Over the plant's lifetime, more than 7 million vehicles passed through those doors, including approximately 2.3 million Commodores. A new starter walking through the gates for the first time would feel the scale before understanding it. The press shop alone, those 15-metre bays, generated a physical concussion you could feel in your chest, a rhythmic boom as the presses stamped quarter panels and roof skins from flat steel at a rate that made conversation pointless. You didn't talk in the press shop. You gestured, you pointed, you learned to read lips and hand signals the way a flight deck crew does. The old hands wore earplugs they'd moulded themselves from workshop putty. The new blokes got issued foam ones that fell out every 20 minutes. Moved through to the body shop and the sound changed, a higher register, the snap and hiss of robotic welders firing in sequence, blue-white light flickering across the ceiling in patterns that repeated every 76 seconds, perfectly synchronized. The air tasted of welding flux and hot metal. The trim shop was quieter, but not quiet. The whir of pneumatic tools, the snap of clips being pressed into place, the low conversation of workers who could finally hear each other. And always, underneath everything, the hum of the conveyor, the backbone of the whole operation, moving at a pace that never varied, that set the rhythm of every task and every break and every shift. In a South Australian summer, when the temperature outside hit 42 degrees and the factory's ventilation, designed decades earlier for milder conditions, couldn't keep pace. The press shop could reach 50 degrees inside. Workers improvised, wet rags around the neck, thermos flasks of iced water stashed behind jigs. The blokes in the paint shop had it worst, full protective suits in a booth, where the air was heated to cure the finish. Management installed industrial fans. The men who'd been there 20 years said you stopped noticing the heat the same way you stopped noticing the noise. The occupational health reports, decades later, said otherwise. Chapter 5. The town the Commodore built Professor Alastair Thompson, who leads the People, Places and Promises Oral History Project at Monash University, 100 planned interviews, funded by the Australian Research Council, in partnership with the National Motor Museum and the National Library of Australia, documented something the glossy corporate histories never mentioned. Elizabeth had a class system, rigid and unspoken, built into the architecture of the canteen. 3 separate dining areas, one for the shop floor workers, the plebs, as they called themselves without bitterness, because they knew where they stood, one for white-collar staff, and one for the executive groupers, who ate behind closed doors. The food was the same, the tables weren't, but the men and women who worked that floor built something more complicated than a hierarchy. Bob Pulford started in the Dandenong paint shop in 1958, when he was barely old enough to shave. Thompson's researchers recorded the moment Pulford teared up decades later, recalling a foreman who forced him to work overtime rather than attend the birth of his child. The same man, in the same interview, described how he'd taken Italian lessons so he could speak to the blokes on his line. Migrants from Calabria and Sicily who'd arrived with trade skills and no English, and who taught Pulford as much about coachwork as any technical manual. Italian migrant Tony Liberatore started at Fisherman's Bend in 1954. When a foreman asked him to work Christmas Day, Tony agreed, but made the distinction clear. He'd do it for the foreman, not for GM. That same foreman later helped Liberatore gain accreditation as a qualified mechanic, despite having no formal Australian training. Alex Angelico rose to become a leading hand in prototype development. These weren't exceptions. They were the texture of the place, loyalty running sideways between workers as much as it ran upward to the company. The migrant workforce was the plant's backbone, and Elizabeth was built to attract them. The British were the primary group. The advertising campaigns in England had done their job. But Italians came, Greeks came, Yugoslavs, Serbians, Croatians came. Vietnamese families arrived in the late 70s and 80s. Later, Afghan Hazara communities found their first foothold in Australia on the Elizabeth production line. The factory floor at any given moment held a dozen languages, a dozen lunch traditions, moussaka alongside meat pies, pho next to pasties, and a shared understanding that the work was the common ground. You didn't need perfect English to stamp a quarter panel or fit a wiring loom. You needed hands and timing and the willingness to do it 620 times a day. Women concentrated in the trim shop, upholstery, interior assembly, the detail work that required dexterity more than brute force. The primary union was the Vehicle Builders Employees Federation, later absorbed into the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. Workers recalled bitter industrial strife in the late 60s and early 70s, walk-offs, go-slows, the union flexing its muscle in an era when Australian manufacturing unions could bring a production line to a halt and mean it. But they also recalled the Holden Social Club, which cut across every division the canteen enforced: sporting teams, social nights, the annual events that brought shop floor workers and supervisors into the same room with a beer in hand, and the legendary Holden family Christmas party, where the kids of the blokes on the line ran through the car park while their parents, for one afternoon, weren't workers or management. They were just families who all depended on the same factory. Outside the gates, Elizabeth was a community that owed its existence to what happened inside them. The Elizabeth City Centre shopping complex anchored the suburb's commercial life. The Central District Football Club, the Bulldogs, won 9 SANFL premierships during 12 consecutive grand final appearances between 2000 and 2011, a dynasty fuelled by a supporter base that bled working-class blue. The Red Lion Hotel, Lyle McEwen Hospital, Fremont Park with its lake and fountain, the Playford Civic Centre and Shedley Theatre. The Northern Sound System, a youth music venue that gave local kids somewhere to go. The Edinburgh Parks Industrial Estate, established in 1997, grew specifically to serve the Holden supply chain. Dozens of smaller manufacturers making components, sub-assemblies, wiring, plastics, glass, all feeding the appetite of the plant down the road. And the car itself, what the factory sent into the world, had become something that transcended transport. The jingle football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars, adapted with characteristic Australian irreverence from a Chevrolet original, was one of the most recognised slogans in the country. The HQ Holden, built from 1971 to 1974, sold 485,650 units and spawned the Kingswood, the Monaro and the Sandman, names that still carry weight in any pub car park in Australia. The Commodore VB, launched in October 1978 on a re-engineered Opel record platform, won Wheels Car of the Year and became Australia's #1 selling car by 1979. And then there was Bathurst. Peter Brock, the king of the mountain, won the Bathurst 1,009 times driving Holdens, most famously in 1979 when he and co-driver Jim Richards won by 6 laps. 6 laps. In a race where margins are usually measured in seconds. Holden accumulated 34 Bathurst victories to Ford's 21, and the rivalry between the two, Holden versus Ford, red versus blue, defined Australian motorsport for half a century and seeped into the culture far beyond the track. You were a Holden family or a Ford family. It wasn't negotiable, it was inherited, like eye colour or a football team. Holden's market share in 1958 had exceeded 50% with a single model range. The FC. Every second new car sold in Australia carried the Lion badge. No manufacturer, before or since, has matched that dominance in the Australian market. Chapter 6. The summit they couldn't see past. Commodore sales peaked at 94,642 units in 1998. Total Holden sales peaked at 178,392 in 2002, delivering a profit of $265.6 million and a market share of 21.4%. The Elizabeth plant, running 3 shifts around the clock, was exporting vehicles to 3 continents, Commodores rebadged as Chevrolet Luminas for the Middle East, as Pontiac G8S for America, as Chevrolet Omegas for Brazil, as Vauxhall Monaros for Britain. In 2007, more than 36,000 vehicles left Elizabeth for foreign ports. An Australian-made sedan, designed in Melbourne and built in Adelaide by the grandchildren of immigrants, was being driven on highways in Dubai and Detroit and Sao Paulo. Inside the plant, confidence was absolute. Holden chairman Peter Hannenberger, who'd overseen the export push in the early 2000s, captured the mood in a phrase that would age badly. I couldn't give a shit what they thought in America. Elizabeth was building the best cars it had ever built. The engineers knew it. The workers knew it. The quality metrics confirmed it. The billion-dollar VE Commodore development program was underway, and the future, a global Zeta platform that would underpin 15 models worldwide, promised to make Elizabeth a cornerstone of GM's international architecture. But the numbers underneath the confidence told a different story, if anyone had cared to read them closely. In March 2003, Toyota overtook Holden as Australia's best-selling car brand. Holden never regained the position. The small car market, Corollas, Camrys, and a growing wave of Korean competitors, priced thousands below anything Elizabeth could build, was eating the volume that large sedans had once commanded. Young Australians weren't buying Commodores the way their fathers had. They were buying hatchbacks. They were buying SUVs. They were buying imports that cost less, used less fuel, and carried none of the tribal loyalty that had sustained Holden for half a century. The Australian dollar, which had bottomed at 47 cents against the US dollar in 2001, making Elizabeth's exports cheap and competitive, was climbing. The mining boom was pulling the currency upward, and every cent it gained made an Australian-built car a little more expensive on world markets. The same mineral wealth that was enriching Western Australia and Queensland was quietly poisoning the economics of manufacturing in Adelaide and Melbourne. Economists had a name for it. They called it Dutch disease. The workers at Elizabeth just knew that the export orders were getting harder to land. And somewhere in Detroit, in the offices where GM's global strategy was being redrawn after decades of complacency, executives were looking at a spreadsheet that showed Australian production at less than 1% of the company's worldwide output. The plant that employed 4,500 people in Elizabeth, that had built 7 million cars, that powered a suburb and anchored a supply chain and defined a national identity, was a rounding error on a balance sheet in Michigan. That was the summit. They just didn't know it yet. Chapter 7. The Man Who Tore Down the Wall. His name was John Button, born 1933, Ballarat, a regional Victorian city that knew something about what happened when the gold ran out. He'd trained as a labour lawyer at Maurice Blackburn, the Melbourne firm synonymous with the union movement, and entered the Senate as a Labour man in 1974. By 1983, he was Australia's industry minister. He would hold that portfolio for a decade, the longest-serving industry minister in the country's history. And in that decade, he would do more to reshape Australian manufacturing than any individual before or since. Button believed the car industry had become bloated and uncompetitive behind decades of tariff protection. He wasn't wrong about the numbers. By the early 1980s, Australia had 13 locally manufactured car models spread across 5 manufacturers in a market of 15 million people. Japan, with 8 times the population, had consolidated more aggressively. The tariff wall that protected Australian manufacturers, running at 57.5%, meant consumers paid a massive premium for locally built cars, and manufacturers had no incentive to modernise or export because the captive market absorbed whatever they built, however they built it. On the 30th of May 1984, Button announced the Motor Industry Development Plan, the Button Car Plan. Its logic was brutal in its simplicity: reduce the number of locally manufactured models from 13 to 6, consolidated into 3 manufacturer groups, cut tariffs from 57.5% to 15% by the year 2000, dropping 2.5 percentage points per year from 1988. Increase import quotas from 30,000 to 175,000 vehicles. Provide $150 million for retraining and research. The plan forced alliances that nobody wanted and nobody believed in. Nissan Pulsars were rebadged and sold as Holden Astras. Toyota Corollas became Holden Novas. Holden Commodores were sold as Toyota Lexans. These hybrids were marketing absurdities. A Corolla buyer didn't want a Holden badge, and a Holden buyer didn't want a Corolla underneath. The Corolla and Camry outsold the Nova and Apollo 7-1. The badge engineering experiment proved what the industry already knew. You couldn't trick Australian car buyers into loyalty they hadn't chosen. But the tariff trajectory, that was irreversible. It had the force of bipartisan conviction behind it. The Hawke government had floated the Australian dollar in December 1983, the single most consequential economic reform of the era, and tariff reduction was part of the same philosophy. Expose Australian industry to global competition, and the strong would survive. The weak would not. That was the theory. The tariffs fell. 22.5% by 1997, 15% by 2000, 10 by 2005, 5 by 2010. Each reduction arrived in a budget paper or a ministerial statement, each one small enough to seem manageable. But they accumulated, and with each cut, the industries that might have lobbied against the next one were a little smaller, a little weaker, a little less able to make the case that they still mattered. Nissan was the first to fall. On the 20th of February 1992, the company announced the closure of its Clayton plant in Melbourne's southeast. 2,000 direct jobs gone. The factory that had built Bluebirds and Pulsars for a generation shut its doors, and the car industry shrank from 4 manufacturers to 3. Nobody in Elizabeth paid much attention. Holden was bigger, stronger, more Australian. The Commodore was still king. The tariff was still high enough. The dollar was still low enough. The maths still worked, just. But outside Elizabeth Gates, the forces were multiplying. Toyota had been manufacturing in Australia since 1963 and moved to a $420 million facility at Altona in Melbourne's west in 1994. By 2003, Toyota overtook Holden as Australia's top-selling brand. Mitsubishi, operating from Tonsley Park in Adelaide's southern suburbs, the other car factory in South Australia, accumulated $1.5 billion in losses before closing on the 31st of March 2008. 930 jobs. Adelaide's second car plant, gone. The Korean manufacturers attacked from below. Hyundai's Excel arrived in 1986, priced at $9,990, the only new car in Australia under $10,000. It wasn't a Commodore. It wasn't trying to be. It was cheap, it was reliable enough, and it found buyers who couldn't afford what Elizabeth was building. By 1998, the Excel was Australia's third best-selling car, and then the mining boom lit the fuse under the exchange rate. The Australian dollar, which had sunk to 47 cents against the US dollar in 2001, a rate that had made Elizabeth's exports viable and competitive, surged to $1.10 in July 2011 and stayed near parity for years. Every cent the dollar climbed made an Australian-built Commodore more expensive in Dubai, in Detroit, in Sao Paulo. The same iron ore and coal that were making Western Australia rich were making South Australian manufacturing impossible. Former Holden managing director Denny Mooney summarised it with the exhausted clarity of a man who'd run the numbers 1,000 times. The tariff going down and exchange rate going up like they did, I don't know how you survive. Free trade agreements compounded the damage. The agreement with Thailand, signed in 2005, was particularly devastating. Cheap Thai-manufactured vehicles flooded the Australian market, with virtually no reciprocal Australian exports flowing the other way. The agreement with the United States, signed the same year, opened the door without offering Elizabeth anything to walk through it. Inside the plant, the infrastructure was ageing. The press shop tooling needed investment GM wouldn't authorise. The paint shop technology was a generation behind the best Asian plants. Australian production sat below 85,000 units a year, far short of the 200,000 needed for efficient scale. Labour costs were 4 times those of GM's Asian operations and double Europe's. An academic named Conley, studying the pattern in 2022, identified a cycle that had repeated for decades. New government assistance, followed by declining tariff protection, followed by new investment, followed by inadequate restructuring, followed by weak profitability, followed by declining market share, followed by new government assistance. Each loop failed to break the spiral. Each loop left the industry a little smaller, and the next crisis a little closer. By 2006, Holden's market share had fallen to 15%. The company hadn't posted a profit since 2004. And in Detroit, General Motors itself was sliding toward the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. Chapter 8. 5 decisions and a phone call. The first decision was made in a bankruptcy court. On the 1st of June 2009, General Motors filed for Chapter 11, protection in New York, the culmination of decades of mismanagement, market share erosion, and a global financial crisis that had finally stopped the bleeding by stopping the patient's heart. When GM emerged from bankruptcy, it killed Pontiac, Hummer, Saturn, and Saab. Holden survived, but the Pontiac brand had been Elizabeth's lifeline. The Commodore, rebadged as the Pontiac G8, had been the plant's cornerstone export to North America. Overnight, the program that justified the billion-dollar VE Commodore development was gone. The car existed. The market for it didn't. GM's post-bankruptcy leadership looked at every international subsidiary through a single lens. Does it make money? And if not, can it be made to? Australia's answer to both questions was increasingly difficult to frame as yes. Peter Hannenberger's era, I couldn't give a shit what they thought in America, was over. Post-bankruptcy GM was, as one insider put it, a different organisation. The organisation that had tolerated unprofitable subsidiaries out of legacy loyalty or strategic optimism no longer existed. What replaced it counted dollars. The second decision looked briefly like salvation. In March 2012, Prime Minister Julia Gillard, South Australian Premier Jay Weatherill and Victorian Premier Ted Baillieu announced a $1 billion 10-year co-investment package for Holden. $275 million in government funds, the rest from GM. 2 new models guaranteed at Elizabeth. Manufacturing secured until 2022. Holden's managing director Mike Devereaux told the media in February 2013, with what sounded like genuine conviction, I can categorically tell you we have already begun working on the Commodore that comes after this one. But the package was politically fragile from the start. In February 2011, Gillard had already cut the $1.3 billion Green Car Innovation Fund, a source of potential future industry support, to pay for Queensland flood reconstruction. The money that was committed depended on a political environment that was about to change completely. The third decision was an axe, and it fell fast. Tony Abbott's coalition government was elected on the 18th of September 2013. Within weeks, $500 million was cut from automotive industry assistance. A productivity commission review was commissioned, widely understood, inside the industry and out, as providing political cover for a withdrawal that had already been decided in principle. Holden, simultaneously, was seeking an additional $265 million in government support beyond the $275 million already committed under Gillard's package. Industry Minister Ian Macfarlane maintained negotiations, but set a deadline of March or April 2014 for resolution. Holden didn't get until March. The fourth decision, the one that lit the fuse, happened on the floor of Parliament. On the 10th of December 2013, Treasurer Joe Hockey stood in the House of Representatives and demanded that Holden come clean with the Australian people about their manufacturing intentions. His words carried the weight of a dare. Either you're here or you're not. Prime Minister Abbott was in South Africa, attending Nelson Mandela's funeral. Acting Prime Minister Warren Truss wrote to Holden, Managing Director Mike Devereaux, demanding an immediate statement clarifying their intentions. Senator Kim Carr, Labor Victoria, a man who had fought for the car industry for years, later described what Hockey had done with cold precision, an implied threat, and General Motors understood it as such. They understood it in Detroit within hours. And here is the moment the documentary has been building toward, the revelation that turns tragedy into something sharper. At General Motors in August 2013 as Vice President of Global Purchasing, at General Motors in August 2013 as Vice President of International Relations. He had been at GM for less than 5 months. He had never set foot in Elizabeth. He had never watched a Commodore come off the line, never walked the press shop floor, never eaten in any of Elizabeth's 3 canteens. At the Detroit Motor Show in January 2015, Jacoby told journalists what no one at GM had previously admitted publicly. I was the one who decided to stop production in Australia. The formal decision, Jacoby confirmed, came at an extraordinary GM board meeting involving CEO Dan Ackerson, convened just hours after Joe Hockey's parliamentary dare. While Hockey was speaking in Canberra, Mike Devereaux, the man who had fought harder than any other executive to keep Elizabeth alive, was across town, testifying before the Productivity Commission. Under oath, Devereaux told the Commission, no decision has been made. He left the hearing for a conference call with Detroit. The decision had been made. One man in a Canberra hearing room, fighting for the plant. Another man in a Detroit boardroom, pulling the trigger. Connected by a single phone call. The gap between those 2 rooms, 16,000 kilometres of ocean and copper wire and corporate hierarchy, is where 69 years of Australian car manufacturing ended. The 5th decision was the announcement. On the 11th of December 2013, GM chairman Dan Ackerson confirmed from Detroit that Holden would cease manufacturing by end of 2017. He cited what he called the perfect storm of negative influences: the sustained strength of the Australian dollar, the high cost of production, the small domestic market, and what he described as the most competitive and fragmented auto market in the world. In Australia, Devereux, the fighter, the man who'd gone to the mat for Elizabeth, faced the television cameras and said the words he'd spent years trying to avoid. Building cars in this country is just not sustainable, as painful as it is to say. A senior Holden insider told journalists afterward that Devereux had known for some time that the numbers pointed to closure. From a business perspective, Mike knew the sensible thing to do would be close manufacturing. But Mike's a fighter, and Holden got under his skin. GM thanked him by promoting him to Shanghai, out of Australia, away from the plant he'd tried to save and the workforce that had trusted him. The dominoes had already been falling. Ford announced first, on the 23rd of May, 2013. Ford Australia President Bob Graziano had been blunt. Our costs are double that of Europe and nearly 4 times Ford in Asia. Toyota followed on the 10th of February, 2014, global CEO Akio Toyoda flying from Japan to stand alongside Australian President Max Yasuda for the announcement. Devereux himself had warned publicly in June 2013 what Toyota's departure would mean. Manufacturing is viable with 2 of us. I don't think it's viable with 1. The supply chain logic was merciless. The parts manufacturers, the dozens of component firms in Edinburgh Parks and across Adelaide and Melbourne, needed volume from at least 2 car makers to survive. Once Ford left, the economics of the entire supply network collapsed. It wasn't a domino effect. It was a structural failure. Remove 1 pillar, and the roof comes down. ESSA Premier Jay Weatherill, whose uncle had worked at Holden for 47 years, whose mother had worked in car components, called the closure a dramatic mistake, a monumental mistake. He released Our Jobs Plan in January 2014, committing $60 million in state funds and requesting $333 million from Canberra. Industry Minister McFarlane rejected it as band-aid measures. The subsidy arithmetic, when it was finally laid out in public, was savage. Holden had received $2.17 billion in federal assistance over 12 years, 2001 to 2012, averaging $153 million a year. With 85,000 cars built in 2012, that worked out to approximately $23,500 per vehicle in government support. For industry-specific assistance to firms in automotive manufacturing are weak, and the economy-wide costs of such assistance outweighed the benefits. $23,000 a car. That was the number that killed the argument for keeping the lights on. Whether it was the right number or the whole number, or whether it accounted for the tax revenue and supply chain employment and community infrastructure that the industry sustained, those were questions that the Commission's framework wasn't designed to ask. Chapter 9. The last 76 seconds, in August 2013, 1,700 Elizabeth workers voted to accept a 3-year wage freeze. They did it to save their jobs. They did it knowing the numbers. They did it anyway. It bought nothing. In April 2013, 400 of 1,250 assembly line positions were cut. On the 7th of October 2016, the same day Ford closed its Broadmeadows plant in Melbourne, the last Holden crews rolled off the Elizabeth line. 270 more positions gone. By the final months, approximately 950 workers remained. Average length of service, 20 years. Leslie Desmond had worked at Elizabeth for 40 years, the plant's longest-serving female employee. She said, "This has been a big part of my life. I'm really going to miss it." Andrew Reid was 44, a team leader 14 years on the line. During the wind down, knowing what was coming, he'd enrolled in a Bachelor of Nursing part-time. He completed it. He spoke at the final ceremony. He'd rebuilt himself while the factory was still standing, which is the kind of thing that sounds like a triumph in a newspaper article, and felt, in the living of it, like mourning something before it was dead. Richard Phillips had started at Elizabeth as an apprentice fitter in 1987 and risen to Executive Director of Manufacturing. 30 years. From apprentice to the man who turned the lights off. On the final day, Phillips said, In the final years of production, we have been building categorically the best quality cars to ever roll out of this plant. The best cars Elizabeth ever built were the last ones. There's something in that. On the morning of the 20th of October, 2017, workers arrived at Elizabeth to find hundreds of Holden fans lining Phillip Highway from 7 o'clock. Many had driven from Perth and Melbourne, 2,000 kilometres and 800 kilometres respectively, for what one journalist called a working-class pilgrimage. Generations of Holdens lined the road, FJs from 1953, HQ Kingswoods, VK Commodores with aftermarket exhausts, VF sedans still under warranty. Every era of the car that Australia built, parked nose to tail on the road to the factory that built it. At 10:45 in the morning, the ceremonial last car, a red-hot VF2 Commodore SS Ave Redline with a black roof, was driven through the factory doors. No actual production occurred that day. The final vehicles had already been completed and were rolled through as a farewell. The ceremony was choreography. The grief was not. Inside, Holden Managing Director Mark Bernhard addressed the workforce. Today is about paying tribute to the generations of men and women across Holden and our supplier network who have given so much to our company. Our MWU South Australian Secretary John Camillo was less diplomatic. When those doors close at Holden, the car industry will close forever, he said. History will remember this as the greatest betrayal of blue-collar workers by the coalition government. Tony Abbott, Joe Hockey and Malcolm Turnbull ought to be ashamed of themselves. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull called it the end of an era. Labor MP Nick Champion, member for the Elizabeth region, the man who represented these workers in Canberra, said, "We're not just losing a car. We're not just losing an industrial capability. We're losing an icon." After the ceremony, the entire workforce was bussed to Adelaide Oval for a private farewell. The union had asked Holden not to let workers leave through the front door. They'd planned to bus them out discreetly, spare them the emotion of the crowd. But when Holden saw the hundreds of people lining Phillip Highway, families, retirees, blokes who'd clocked off that line years ago and come back to watch it end, they ran the buses through the streets. People lined up alongside their Holdens and clapped and applauded as the buses passed. Jimmy Barnes, Cold Chisel frontman, Elizabeth boy, who'd grown up in the suburb and worked briefly at the plant as a teenager, performed at Adelaide Oval that night. He later released the single Shutting Down Our Town, written by Troy Cassar-Daley. Many of the workers kicked on afterward at the Strathmore Hotel, which is where paint shop worker Alex Kyriakopoulos learned something that hadn't been announced at any ceremony. Engineers David D.J. McLean and Joseph Sawyer told him that his car, VIN ending 333644, was actually the very last vehicle through production processes. Last framed, last VIN allocated, last through the paint shop. The ceremonial car was the public farewell. Kyriakopoulos' car was the real one. The ceremonial Commodore is now in the National Motor Museum at Birdwood. Kyriakopoulos' car, the actual last, belongs to the man who built it. Chapter 10. The Mushroom Farm in the Press Shop. The outcomes data tells two stories, and which one you hear depends on who's telling it. The federal government's Asil Allen report, published in 2019, found that 82% of retrenched automotive workers nationally had found work. The number sounded like a success. The AMWU's own survey of 787 Holden workers specifically found something different. Only 34% in secure full-time positions, and fewer than 5% earning equal or better pay and conditions than they'd had at Elizabeth. Union official Dennis Masters put it plainly, "We have only successfully transitioned 41.9% of our members." Professor Andrew Beer at the University of South Australia led a 5-year longitudinal study of 800 former auto workers. By 2023, he found better outcomes than expected, more than 80% in work, partly because generous redundancy packages, years of warning, and the unexpected post-COVID economic boom had softened the landing. But age was devastating. The workers over 55, the ones who'd given Elizabeth 20, 30 years, were the ones the new economy didn't want. Peter Hepburn worked at Elizabeth for 29 years. He was 61 when the gates closed. 2 years later, he was still unemployed. "I kept applying for jobs. Still am to this day," he told a reporter. "I'll even clean toilets out." He avoids driving past the site. It's just like losing a part of you. A 61-year-old former supervisor named Simon, his surname kept from the press, applied for shelf-stacking jobs and street-sweeping jobs, and was told each time that he was overqualified. His job centre advisor said, "Don't bother putting in anything. You're not going to get a job." St Vincent de Paul CEO David Walk reported what he called a staggering rise in demand for food and financial relief in Elizabeth after the closure. In December 2017, Melbourne-based developer Pellegro Group acquired the 122.7-hectare site and rebranded it Lionsgate Business Park, a name that references the Holden Lion badge, which was removed from the building in December 2018. The site sits at 180 to 185 Phillip Highway, Elizabeth South, and it is not empty. Genis Steel operates from the former press shops. Sonnen Australia, a German battery company, has a presence. Rynamic Industries makes shutters and blinds. Rooftop solar panels cover former factory roofs. Many of the original buildings stand, repurposed. And in the darkened bays where 100-ton cranes once stamped steel into Commodore quarter panels, the Epicurean Food Group is converting factory space into a massive mushroom production facility, targeting more than 20,000 tons per year. Shiitake and oyster mushrooms, growing in climate-controlled darkness, in buildings designed for 15-metre press operations, and Australian daylight that now enters through no window at all. Pascal Summers, an Irishman who migrated to Adelaide in 1994 specifically for Holden, who rose from press operator to facility manager over 2 decades, is now the general manager of Lionsgate Business Park. He shows visitors through buildings he once worked in under a different name for a different purpose, in a different country's dream. Elizabeth's economic indicators remain grim, though they are improving. The City of Playford's unemployment rate stood at 8.6% in June 2025, double the South Australian state average. Elizabeth ranks among the most disadvantaged suburbs in Australia on the 2021 SEIFA index. And yet house prices have surged. Median listings in Elizabeth South hit $450,000 in 2025, up 38% in 2 years. Not because the local economy recovered, but because Adelaide's broader housing boom, driven by interstate migration and affordability refugees from Sydney and Melbourne, has lifted prices in suburbs where the jobs haven't followed the money. The gap between what the houses cost and what the people in them earn is itself a kind of story. On the 17th of February 2020, GM CEO Mary Barra and President Mark Roos announced the retirement of the Holden brand entirely. Not just manufacturing, the name. No more Holden-badged cars, ever. 600 more jobs vanished. Roos, a former Holden chairman himself, said, "We could not prioritise further investment over all other considerations." Even Ford, the old rival, issued a statement, "A great Aussie brand coming to an end is sad for our country, no matter your allegiance." The company that James Alexander Holden founded from a saddlery in 1856, that his grandson pivoted to motor bodies, that Lawrence Hartnett fought to make into Australia's own car, that Ben Chifley unveiled to a 10-piece orchestra, and called beautiful, that company ceased trading at the end of 2020. 164 years, replaced by GM Specialty Vehicles, importing Chevrolet Silverados and Corvettes. American cars, sold in Australia, wearing an American badge, by an American company that once owned the most powerful brand in Australian manufacturing and decided it wasn't worth keeping. Chapter 11. What the Quiet Remembers. The factory at Elizabeth still stands, in part. The press shop, the body shop, some of the offices. The roofline is visible from the expressway, the same roofline that workers saw every morning for decades as they turned off Main North Road and into the car park. What isn't there is the work. Not the rhythmic boom of the stamping presses, not the blue-white flicker of the welding bays, not the paint shop, where red and white and blue sedans emerged on an overhead conveyor, still wet, catching the fluorescent light. Not the voices, the Italian and Greek and Serbian and Vietnamese and broad South Australian English that made up the sound of a car being built by the people who'd come from everywhere to build it. Not the 7 million cars. Not the 4,500 workers at peak. Not the confidence of a country that believed it could make its own things and sell them to the world. What remains is the building, the sun on corrugated iron, the quiet inside it where the work used to be. In 1948, Ben Chifley stood before silver curtains in a social hall at Fisherman's Bend and watched them part to reveal a cream-coloured sedan on black velvet. And he said, "She's a beauty." In 2017, Richard Phillips, who had started as an apprentice fitter in the same company 30 years earlier, who had risen to run the manufacturing operation, who stood on the line as the last car rolled through, looked at what Elizabeth had built and said, "She's perfect." Between those two men, those two sentences, those two cars separated by 69 years and 7 million vehicles, between Chifley's hope and Phillips's farewell, is the whole story of what Australia made and what it lost and the silence it left behind.